Section 6: Body Maps and Points of View. Rita Carter identifies neural body maps in the brain, representations of our bodies, as the physical basis of the self, presumably the me part of the self. These neural maps, rather than by any actual interface between our skin and air, provide our sense of physical boundedness. She points out that amputees often suffer from phantom limbs, quote, because the body map in their brains keeps telling their boundary is where it used to be and not where it is now. And people born without limbs may complain of phantoms even though they have never had the parts that they experience, end quote. Carter deduces from this that, quote, our body maps are built in rather than learned concepts, yet they are firmly grounded in the external world and remain intact only so long as they receive appropriate sensory feedback from physical interaction between the body and the environment. The maps sometimes get stuck in a configuration that is incongruent with the real body, as with phantom limbs. But normally they adapt to match the changes in the physical body so well that we are unaware of their illusory nature. They move as the body moves, grow as it grows, and age as the flesh ages. Yet the boundaries of our body maps are not drawn rigidly around the surface of our skin. Rather, they reflect a more fluid idea of where the body begins and ends, end quote. But how durable is the form of the self based on this physical entity in the brain? Carter says the boundary drawn in the brain to define the self from the non-self is permeable and fluid. The brain system on which it's based can be shown in certain situations to generate illusions. She then says that the boundary we draw around our non-physical self is even more changeable and plastic. Quote, sometimes we feel our mental realm is huge, solid, and impervious. At other times we feel shrunken and transparent, as though you could dissolve like a disprin in a glass of water, end quote. Carter then discusses how profoundly these social contexts can affect where we draw the boundary of our ego self, quote. The modern Western world is highly individuated, and the selves within it generally regard themselves as discrete atoms of consciousness, constantly interacting with one another, but essentially separate, end quote. Other cultures, however, define the self almost exclusively in terms of social interactions, such as Polynesian islanders asked, for example, to describe an emotion like sadness. The response will be to describe a sad social situation rather than an inner feeling. But even in our atomist societies, we can experience the boundaries of ourselves as flexible. Part of the process of falling in love, for example, is the feeling of merging with another person. Also, when we form groups, such as choirs or sports teams, our boundaries can, again, become permeable. Carter says that, quote, like ants in a colony or bees in a hive, our individual intentions become subsumed by that of the group, end quote. But even though the boundary of self is not firm and stable, but shifting and permeable, and drawn at least partly by social and environmental contingencies, Carter says that it is nevertheless, quote, essential that we think it is firm and unyielding, because only then can we think of ourselves as located within it, end quote. This sense of physical location is important for our sense of self because it provides us with a unique point of view. Carter says, quote, only by being located can we have a point of view which is ours and ours alone, a unique, private, and owned little slice of the conscious universe. Owned experience is our window on the outside world, but one that only ever accords a limited view. For example, we see objects literally from the point from which we view them, end quote. Combining this personal point of view with the concept of an objective world is the problem addressed by Thomas Nagel's book, The View from Nowhere. This phrase also represents the outlook of classical Newtonian science, which, rather than a personal perspective, seeks to take a God's eye view of the world. Carter also considers the durability of the self in terms of what she calls the fridge light problem. As implied, this is the problem that when we want to examine consciousness, brackets, the fridge light, we have to direct our attention to it, that is, open the door. This can create the illusion that the light is always on, or that consciousness is always in operation. Quote, when we talk about normal experience, then we are talking about self-consciousness, that is, not consciousness of self, but consciousness with self. Thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are things that happen to or are done by this self and may have no existence without it. Conversely, it is difficult to imagine what would be left of the self if the stream of experience stopped flowing through it. A self without an inner life is not our idea of a self at all. Yet self and experience are not one and the same. Every night, when we enter the quietest stage of sleep, experience is reduced to little or perhaps nothing. Yet our self pops up again in the morning, undiminished. So even if it depends on the flow of experience for its moment-by-moment existence, it must also have some durable form, enough anyway for it to be reborn each morning, end quote.